Have you ever wondered what it was like to live in a time when everything was uncertain, and yet somehow everything felt more meaningful? When ration stamps replaced grocery lists, and hope wasn't found in headlines, but in letters from overseas, or the quiet rhythm of a family meal shared at home, would you go back if you could? Would you want to live in the 1940s? Not the version we see on TV, but the real one. The one with blackout curtains and patched up clothes, with coal furnaces and bread made from what little was left in the pantry, with worry etched into every mother's face, and courage tucked behind every soldier's goodbye. Welcome to Sleepy Town Radio, where stories drift like smoke through an open window, and the past always has a seat at the table. Tonight, we're traveling back to a decade that changed America forever. Not in grand gestures, but in quiet, enduring ways. It was a time defined by war, yes, but also by work, by willpower, and by the way ordinary people carried on through extraordinary circumstances. The 1940s were not simple. They were not easy, but they were honest. And somehow, even through the hardship, beautiful. Imagine a kitchen in 1943. The walls are thin. The radio hums softly. There's no abundance, but there is enough. A mother stirs a pot of stew, careful to stretch the ingredients just one more day. Her children sit nearby, folding newspapers for the scrap drive. There's a warmth, not from luxury, but from love and determination. These are the moments that built the decade. Not the headlines, but the hush behind them. Not the battles, but the breakfasts before them. Not the flags, but the fingers that stitched them together. The Great Depression had left its mark. A long, quiet bruise across the country. And just as the dust began to settle, the drums of war started to beat again. Yet Americans adapted. They rose. They rationed, recycled, relit their spirit. They grew backyard gardens, shared car rides to save fuel, sent sons and daughters to fight, and held on to their letters like lifelines. They worked double shifts. They sewed their own clothes. They turned porches into places of prayer, and kitchens into command centers of resilience. And so tonight, as you settle in, let this story take you there, to a decade worn at the edges, but stitched with strength. Let your mind rest in a slower time, a quieter time, where even the smallest actions, clipping a ration stamp, folding a letter, planting a row of beans, meant something greater. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a memory, a tribute to a generation that endured, to ordinary days that held extraordinary weight. So stay with us a while. Let the noise of the present fade, and let the voices of the past lead you gently back to a time when America was bruised, but brave, weary, but united, tested, but never broken. Because behind every hardship of the 1940s, there was a kind of quiet strength, the kind that doesn't ask to be seen, only remembered. Up next, we'll revisit the final echoes of the Great Depression. A moment when dreams were thin, but never fully gone. And the foundation for a new kind of America was quietly, patiently laid. Before the 1940s could truly begin, America was still caught in the long, gray shadow of the Great Depression. It's easy now to look back at old black and white photos, dusty roads, lined faces, boarded windows, and imagine a country paused in silence. But for the people living it, there was no stillness, only quiet struggle. Day after day, jobs had vanished, Homes were lost. Dreams went missing too. And yet, life pressed on. Even when there was nothing left to fall back on, people found something to move forward with. Imagine a family in 1935. The father once worked in a bustling factory. Now he waits in line for bread. The mother cuts up worn-out dresses to make shirts for her sons. The children carry pails of water, their shoes held together with bits of string. There's no extra, no waste, no luxury, but there is love and grit. Some nights, dinner was boiled potatoes and nothing more. Some weeks, the house grew cold. Coal was too expensive. And yet, every morning, folks opened their curtains, took a breath, and tried again. People made do. That's the phrase you'll hear most from those who lived through it. We just made do. And somehow, those 3 words carry more strength than any speech. They grew gardens, even in dusty lots. They patched the same pair of pants over and over again. They saved string, tin, paper, and bacon grease. Because anything, truly anything, could be useful. Fun was frugal. A Saturday night meant a family game around the kitchen table, or a radio show if you were lucky enough to own one. Even the movies, once a beloved escape, became too costly. People gave them up, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. But what you notice, again and again, when you talk to people from that era, is that they don't speak with bitterness. Instead, they remember the way neighbors helped neighbors, how you never knocked on a door empty-handed, how a single piece of bread could be split 6 ways, and everyone still said, "Thank you." There was a code of decency, an unspoken promise. If you had a little, you shared it. If someone fell, you didn't walk away. You bent down and helped them back up. That spirit, it's not something easily found today. But back then, it was everywhere. And children, perhaps more than anyone, learned to see beauty in simplicity. A stick became a sword, a tin can, a drum, an old tire, a carnival ride. Without toys or gadgets or pocket change, kids made memories from dirt roads and porch swings. They didn't know they were poor. Not really, because they had stories and sunrises and each other. And sometimes that was enough. As the 1930s drew to a close, America began to stand again, slowly, carefully. Government programs brought jobs, building roads, planting forests, writing books, painting murals, telling stories. People started to believe again, not in riches, but in survival, in the possibility that tomorrow might be just a little better than today. So as we continue our story into the 1940s, remember this: that decade wasn't built on momentum. It was built on resilience, on the backs of those who had already lost so much, but refused to lose hope. The 1940s would bring new trials, new sacrifices, and a war that touched every life, but they would face it the way they always had, together, with calloused hands, steady hearts, and that quiet, familiar phrase on their lips: "We'll make do." Up next, we enter a world at war, not through maps or politics, but through the eyes of ordinary people whose lives changed forever one Sunday morning in December 1941. Just as the country was beginning to stand again, shaky but upright, scarred but still hopeful, Another storm appeared on the horizon. Across the ocean, trouble had been building. In Europe, countries fell like dominoes. In Asia, entire nations were caught in the sweep of a growing empire. At first, most Americans watched from a distance. The memories of World War I were still fresh. The loss, the fear, the graves. No one wanted to see their sons shipped off again. And so, isolation became comfort. Stay out of it. Stay safe. Let the rest of the world sort itself out. But war doesn't wait for permission. It started quietly. Headlines spoke of faraway places, Poland, France, China. Radio broadcasts told of invasions, of leaders shouting in foreign tongues. To many, it still felt like another world. Something terrible, yes, but distant, unreal. Then came a Sunday morning in December 7th, 1941. A date that would forever divide before from after. In the quiet of early day, Japanese aircraft descended on Pearl Harbor. Within minutes, the harbor was in flames. Ships sank. Sailors died. And something deep inside America shifted. What had been unthinkable became unavoidable. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. His voice calm but firm. He called it a date which will live in infamy. And with those words, America entered the war. Across the country, people stood still. Radios pressed to ears, hearts sinking, then hardening. A sleeping giant had been awakened. In small towns and cities alike, the news spread like wildfire. Boys enlisted, mothers wept. Factories changed overnight. One moment, you were making toasters. The next, you were building tanks. The transformation was staggering. By early 1942, America had gone from economic collapse to becoming the industrial heart of the Allied forces. This wasn't just about soldiers. This was about everyone. If you weren't on the battlefield, you were still in the fight. Men trained. Women took up tools. Children collected scrap metal, rubber, and string. Everyone sacrificed something. Time, food, comfort, loved ones. And they did it. Together. Flags appeared in windows. Gold stars marked those who had fallen. Communities rallied. Neighbors leaned in closer. And amidst the fear, there was also resolve. You can still hear it in the voices of those who lived through it. A steadiness, a sense that no matter how hard it was, they weren't alone in it. There was grief, yes, but there was also purpose. Church bells rang for departing trains. Post offices became the lifeline for those left behind. Every knock at the door could mean a letter or a telegram no one wanted to read. Still, the country pressed on because it had to. For those on the home front, war became a way of life. Blackout curtains were drawn at night. Air raid drills became routine. People learned to live with less sugar, less meat, less gasoline, but never less heart. They kept faith, they kept working, and they kept waiting for sons and husbands to come home, waiting for the war to end, waiting for peace. And through it all, they hoped. That hope didn't come from speeches or parades. It came from the ordinary moments, from the sound of a mail carrier's footsteps, from a photograph tucked inside a wallet, from a neighbor offering sugar when yours had run out, from the small, stubborn belief that the world could come back together again and maybe be stronger for it. Next, we'll explore the factories and fields of this transformed America. a nation that became the arsenal of democracy, turning its hands, its tools, and its spirit toward a future that demanded everything and gave something back. Once the decision was made, once America was at war, the transformation came fast. Factories that had sat idle during the Depression, their machines coated in dust, suddenly flickered back to life. But they weren't making radios or bicycles anymore. They were building bombers, jeeps, tanks, and ships. And the workers were no longer just men. Almost overnight, an entire nation shifted from survival to production. The United States had become something new, what President Roosevelt would famously call the arsenal of democracy. The numbers were staggering. Between 1939 and 1945, the country's gross national product more than doubled. Unemployment, once in the double digits, fell to almost nothing. More than 17 million new jobs were created. And this time, the doors opened to people long shut out. Women, African Americans, immigrants, all were suddenly in demand. They welded, they stitched, they built engines and inspected rivets, each hand a piece of something greater than itself. Imagine walking through one of those war plants in 1943. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the steady rhythm of determination. Men in grease-streaked overalls, women in headscarves and slacks, standing shoulder to shoulder on a factory floor that ran 24 hours a day. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, noisy, and often dangerous, but it was purposeful. Every bolt tightened, every bullet packed, every bomber finished, meant one more chance for someone overseas to survive. Even the small towns got swept into the war effort. A furniture plant in North Carolina began building airplane wings. A toy factory in Michigan turned out ammunition belts. A sewing cooperative in Missouri stitched parachutes by the hundreds. This wasn't just industry. It was unity. Every county, every city, every block had a role to play. Even school children joined in, collecting rubber, paper, and scrap metal in neighborhood drives. Nothing went to waste, because nothing could be wasted. And behind every industrial number was a human one, a teenage girl, fresh out of high school, learning to weld so her older brother wouldn't be the only one serving, a grandmother, steady and proud, packing rations at the local plant long after her joints should have rested, a man too old to fight, too proud to sit idle, sweeping the factory floor, whistling as he worked, because it still meant something. This was America at full strength, not because of muscle or might, but because of purpose, because for once, everyone was working toward the same goal. There were no headlines for most of these people, no medals, no parades, just long days and longer nights. But they didn't ask for thanks. They just kept going. It's easy now to look back and marvel at the scale of production, the steel, the machines, the numbers. But what really mattered was the spirit behind it all. It wasn't just about winning a war. It was about building something together, reclaiming identity, restoring dignity, proving, after years of hardship, that the country still had more to give. And it did. Up next, we'll turn from the factories to the everyday families, those who learned to ration, grow their own food, and find comfort in sacrifice. Because on the home front, every meal was a mission, and every garden, a quiet act of hope. War touched every home. Even if you weren't wearing a uniform, Even if you never left your town or saw a battlefield, you still felt the weight of it. Because during the 1940s, life on the home front meant sacrifice, not once or twice, but every single day. And one of the most visible signs of that sacrifice was the ration book, issued by the government and carried like a second wallet. Ration books were filled with small, color-coded stamps, each one limiting how much you could buy, no matter how much money you had. Gasoline, meat, butter, sugar, even shoes and coffee. Everything was controlled. Trips to the grocery store were no longer simple. You couldn't just choose what you wanted. You had to calculate what you were allowed. Families planned their meals like military operations, stretching ingredients, swapping stamps, and hoping the shelves weren't empty that week. Imagine being a young mother in 1943. You've got 3 children to feed, a husband away at war, and a book of stamps that won't last the month. You trade a neighbor for a bit of flour. You skip your own dinner so the kids can have more. And when the clerk at the store says, "I'm sorry, no more butter until next week," you don't complain. You just nod and adjust, because everyone was in it together. And then there were the victory gardens across America. Backyards turned into vegetable plots. City parks became rows of beans and lettuce. Schoolyards were tilled and planted by children. It wasn't just about food. It was about morale. Growing your own produce meant less strain on the national supply. It meant self-reliance. It meant doing your part. Posters encouraged it. Plant a victory garden. Your food is fighting. And people took it to heart. Tomatoes on the windowsill, carrots by the fence, zucchini sprouting beside laundry lines. You can still hear people today, those who were children back then, talking about how proud they felt, digging into the soil with their parents, watching something grow in a world that seemed so filled with uncertainty. Because in the quiet act of planting, there was hope. Each sprout, each leaf, each harvest was a reminder that life still moved forward, that something good could still come from hard ground. Communities also came together in powerful, simple ways. Scrap drives, tin collection days, neighbors gathering bacon grease for ammunition factories. Children were told to save rubber bands, old newspapers, worn-out metal, because nothing was too small to matter. Nothing was wasted, and no one was unneeded. Even the smallest effort felt important. And though the rules were strict, Americans adapted. Cookbooks were rewritten to match ration limits. Creative recipes, using less meat, fewer eggs, no sugar, became household staples. People learned to make do, to substitute, to stretch, and often they did it with grace. But make no mistake, rationing wasn't easy. It was a daily reminder that the world was at war, that your wants had to wait, that patience and planning had become patriotic acts. Still, when you ask those who lived through it, they often remember not the scarcity, but the togetherness, the way neighborhoods shared what they had, the way families learned to get by with less, and still felt full in other ways. Because even in sacrifice, there was unity. Up next, we'll step further into the rhythms of home front life, beyond the stamps and gardens, into the everyday routines of a country adjusting to a new kind of normal. From flour sack dresses to fuel-saving carpools, we'll see how people lived, adapted, and quietly endured. Life during wartime wasn't just about headlines and battles overseas. For most Americans, it was lived quietly, in kitchens, backyards, schoolrooms, and street corners. Daily life on the home front didn't stop because there was a war. It simply shifted, slowed, and became more intentional. You could feel it in the little things. Empty jars rinsed and saved, soap slivers pressed together to make a new bar, paper bags folded and reused again and again. Waste wasn't just frowned upon, it was unpatriotic. People mended, patched, and repurposed. A dress made from an old flour sack wasn't unusual. It was a badge of resourcefulness. If something broke, you fixed it. If you couldn't fix it, you found a new use for it. A cracked bowl might hold buttons. A worn tire might become a swing. Nothing was thrown away casually. Gasoline was rationed, so people carpooled to work or rode bicycles. Sunday drives became rare. Long-distance trips, almost unheard of. You'd see neighbors walking together down dirt roads. Not for leisure, but because it was the only way. And even that walk felt purposeful. A small act of resistance against the pull of war. Home heating fuel was precious, too. Families closed off unused rooms, wore sweaters indoors, gathered around a single wood stove, wrapped in blankets, telling stories, knitting, or simply sitting together in the hush of evening. Candles were kept on hand in case of blackouts. Curtains were drawn tight at night, part of the civil defense effort. Light discipline, they called it. Even your porch light had to stay off. People ate simply. Oatmeal for breakfast, soup made from leftovers, casseroles stretched with rice or breadcrumbs, and if there was meat on the table, it was usually small and shared. A roast chicken might feed a family for 3 days. Roasted the first, sandwiches the second, soup on the third. What mattered wasn't the portion, but the togetherness. Entertainment changed too. There were still laughs, still birthdays, music, dancing, but it all had a quieter tone. Board games came out more often. Children played marbles, hopscotch, or jacks on the porch. Paper dolls cut from catalogs. Wooden toys passed down from older siblings. You could hear radios drifting from open windows, not just for news, but for hope. Music, serial dramas, presidential fireside chats that made you feel a little less alone. School continued, of course, but teachers balanced math and reading with war updates and ration lessons. Children were taught how to help, collecting scrap metal, rolling bandages, planting gardens. Some schools even had drills, just in case. A reminder that even childhood couldn't quite escape the weight of war. Still, there was a softness to it all. Not easy, never easy, but full of small, beautiful acts of normalcy. A mother hanging laundry on the line. A boy brushing snow off the steps before his father got home. Neighbors checking in with one another over a fence. A girl writing in her journal by lamplight. These were the rhythms of home front life. Quiet, persistent, and deeply human. And through it all, people carried on. With grace, with grit, with a kind of quiet strength that didn't make headlines, but held the country together. As we move into the next chapter, we'll shine a light on the women who stepped forward, not just to fill roles left vacant, but to reshape what it meant to contribute, to belong, and to be strong. Because the face of the American workforce was changing. While many American men shipped off to foreign shores, a quiet but extraordinary revolution began on the home front, led not with weapons, but with wrenches, rivets, and resilience. Women, millions of them, stepped forward. They weren't generals, they weren't soldiers, but they were warriors in their own way. They rolled up their sleeves, tied back their hair, and marched into the factories of America, into spaces where women had never been welcomed before. She became a symbol, a face on a poster, a rolled-up sleeve and a bold, determined gaze. Rosie the Riveter, not just a drawing, but a call to action. You saw her in every town, her message clear: we can do it. And they did. Women filled positions in steel plants, shipyards, airplane hangars. They built tanks and bullets, engines and bombs. Their hands shaped the very machines that defended freedom. Their shifts were long, 10, sometimes 12 hours. The work was hard, often dangerous, but they did it anyway, because the country needed them, and because, for the first time, someone believed they could. Of course, not all the jobs were glamorous. Some women sewed parachutes, some tested radios, others packed rations, sorted mail, or worked in typing pools. But every job mattered. Behind each screw tightened, each plane wing riveted, each bandage rolled, was a woman who once might have only been expected to mind a stove or a cradle. Now she was helping win a war. It wasn't just about work. It was about identity. For many women, it was the first time they earned a wage of their own, had their own locker, wore a uniform, signed a paycheck with their name on it. They stood taller, walked differently, saw themselves not just as mothers or daughters, but as contributors, citizens, capable and counted. But it wasn't easy. Daycares were scarce. Some mothers brought their children to work, leaving them in makeshift nurseries beside the factory floor. Others left them with neighbors, with older siblings, or sometimes alone with prayers and a sandwich on the table. And still, they showed up. They did the work because they believed in something larger than themselves. Even the uniforms told a story. Coveralls and headscarves replaced aprons and dresses. Lips stayed red, hair tucked neatly away, as if to say, yes, I can be strong and still be myself. It wasn't about becoming someone new. It was about uncovering someone they'd always been. Of course, when the war ended, many women were expected to return home, to the kitchens, the laundry, the PTA meetings. Some did, quietly, willingly, but others didn't forget what it felt like to hold a tool, to make a decision, to be part of something bigger. Something had shifted. A seed had been planted. And years later, in boardrooms, in courtrooms, in voting booths, you could still hear echoes of that wartime roar. Rosie was more than a poster. She was a promise, a reminder that strength isn't always loud, that courage can wear lipstick, that sometimes the greatest revolutions begin not with fanfare, but with quiet determination behind a factory door. As we leave the factories behind, our next stop brings us back home, to shared meals, patched-up furniture, and a warmth that came not from abundance, but from love. Let's sit at the table for a while and remember what it meant to gather together when togetherness was all we had. After the clang of factory floors and the tireless hum of production lines, there was another rhythm beating quietly through 1940s America. The steady, soft heartbeat of home. Dinner wasn't just a meal back then. It was a moment, a ritual, a gathering of souls around a single flickering light. Even when rations were tight and the pantry looked bare, families made the most of what they had, stretching meatloaf with oats, adding potatoes to every dish, and serving up kindness as the main course. The table didn't have to be grand. A simple wooden one, a little worn around the edges, often patched together with mismatched chairs and hand-sewn tablecloths. Sometimes, the plates didn't match. Sometimes, the silverware was bent, but no one minded. What mattered was the warmth in the room. In many households, the father's chair sat empty. A quiet space held for someone overseas. And so the mother led the prayer, served the food, and smiled through the ache in her chest. Children learned early not to waste a single bite. Every crust of bread, every scoop of mashed turnip, it all meant something. There was ingenuity in the kitchen. Recipes were shared through whispers and handwritten cards, each one adapted to work around what was missing. Casseroles became canvases. A little bit of this, a substitute for that, a dash of imagination, a pinch of memory, and somehow the result always tasted like home. Heating wasn't guaranteed in every room, so families would gather near the stove or fireplace in the evenings, wrapping up in patched quilts sewn from old shirts and worn-out curtains. Those quilts were stories in themselves. A square from Grandpa's flannel, a swatch of Mom's Sunday dress, a faded bit of curtain from the old house before the war. They stitched together more than fabric. They stitched together life. People made do with one car, if they were lucky enough to own one. Trips were grouped together, grocery runs, church on Sundays, maybe a visit to the neighbor down the road, and one radio, just one. It sat proudly on the kitchen counter or in the living room, its warm amber dial glowing through the evening. After dinner, someone would adjust the tuner just right, and families would lean in close to hear the news from the front, or maybe a bit of Bing Crosby before bedtime. Everything was shared. One bathroom for 6 people. One bar of soap passed down the line. One telephone, if there was one at all. Privacy was a luxury, but togetherness was abundant. In those patchwork homes, love didn't come in grand gestures. It came in quiet ones, in the way a mother folded her son's shirt, just so. In the way a daughter swept the floor without being asked. In the way the family dog curled up by the door, waiting for someone who might not return for a long, long time. Neighbors helped neighbors. When someone was short on flour, they didn't go to the store. They knocked on the door next door. When someone lost a loved one, there were casseroles left on porches, and chairs pulled in closer at the dinner table that night. Patchwork wasn't just on quilts. It was in the way people lived, pieced together, worn but whole. They didn't chase perfection. They chased presence. They found beauty in usefulness, grace in grit, and strength in simplicity. And maybe, just maybe, we've forgotten what that feels like, to have just enough, but more than enough because we had each other. As we leave that table now, with its chipped plates and laughter echoing faintly in the air, we step into a quieter part of the evening. The radio clicks back on, the lights dim, and the soft voices of storytellers return. Let's turn the dial just a little and find our way into the next chapter, a golden age of imagination, connection, and the power of voices carried through airwaves. After the dishes were done, after the table was cleared, and the last teacup set back on the shelf, a different kind of gathering began, one that needed no extra chairs, just a little space on the living room floor, and the quiet warmth of each other's presence. Someone would turn the knob, just slowly enough to catch the hum between the stations. And then, with a crackle and a low hiss, the voice would come through, calm, steady, familiar. The radio wasn't just background noise. In the 1940s, it was the heart of the home. It was where news arrived, where music soothed, and where stories came alive. Families would draw close, some seated in armchairs that creaked, others curled up on braided rugs, shoulders pressed against siblings, hands wrapped around mugs still warm from the stove. For a few precious minutes, maybe an hour if the chores were truly done, life paused. You could almost feel the whole country breathe in unison, tuned in to the same voices, the same stories, the same dreams whispered over the airwaves. There were programs for everyone. The grown-ups had Lux Radio Theater, where film stars took to the microphone and brought Hollywood to the heartland. Fibber McGee and Molly offered laughter, real, belly-deep laughter, at a time when many needed it most. Children waited patiently for The Shadow, ears wide, hearts pounding at every twist and turn. And even the dog seemed to listen when Bing Crosby came on, crooning gently from a faraway stage. But more than entertainment, the radio brought connection. Every evening broadcast was a lifeline, especially during wartime. News from Europe, updates from the Pacific. Roosevelt's calm voice during his fireside chats, reaching into homes like a gentle hand on the shoulder, saying, "We're going to be okay. We'll get through this. Together." There was something sacred about the stillness of those evenings. No one scrolled. No one checked a screen. No one walked away mid-story. You listened, you imagined, you felt. Your mind painted pictures the way no television ever could. The way a train sounded as it rounded a corner, the tension in a detective's voice, the soft jazz pouring out as if from a distant rooftop bar in New York. The radio also taught. It gave people a window into places they'd never see, and lives they'd never live. It was the country's shared imagination, a place where rich and poor alike could sit in the same silence and dream in the same direction. And when it wasn't on, you missed it. The quiet that followed was deeper somehow, as if the walls were listening too, as if the whole house exhaled when the dial was turned to 0. In many homes, the radio had a special spot. It was polished with care. Sometimes it had lace doilies under it. Sometimes family photographs stood nearby, frozen smiles of boys in uniform or girls in Sunday dresses waiting for them to return. What makes a moment unforgettable? It's not just the voices, it's the stillness around them. The way your father would nod solemnly at the news, or your mother would smile, just barely, as Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade wrapped around the room like a warm shawl. Those weren't just radio shows. They were threads in the fabric of American memory. Even now, somewhere, in some quiet attic, a dusty old radio waits on a shelf. Its wood worn smooth by time, its dial frozen mid-station, and if you were to plug it in, just maybe, you'd hear an echo, a laugh, a song, a voice calling out softly through time. So let's leave that living room behind now. The soft hum still in our ears, the voices lingering like perfume in the air, because in the next chapter, music will take the lead. Music that carried soldiers through nights of doubt and comforted sweethearts waiting by windows. Let's follow that melody. to where swing met sorrow and ballads became bridges between hearts that beat miles apart. After the voices on the radio had said goodnight and the living room quieted down once more, a softer sound often drifted through the house. Something warm, familiar, and full of longing. It was music, not just any music, but the kind that wrapped itself around your heart and held it gently in place while the world outside seemed to shake. In the 1940s, swing was everywhere. It danced from phonographs in small-town kitchens and echoed through ballroom halls in the cities. There was a rhythm to it, a buoyant, hopeful kind of pulse that reminded people how to smile, even in the darkest hours. Glenn Miller's In the Mood could lift a room like sunshine through a lace curtain. Artie Shaw's clarinet could drift like a breeze over a quiet afternoon. And when Benny Goodman let loose, it was as if every tap shoe and heel in America moved in step. For a country at war, swing wasn't just entertainment. It was therapy. It was energy. It was resilience in a horn section. But there was another kind of music too. When the nights grew longer and letters from overseas came less often, America leaned on the crooners. Voices like Bing Crosby, Nat King Cole, Joe Stafford. They didn't just sing. They whispered comfort. They sang as if they were in the room beside you, hand resting softly on your shoulder. I'll Be Seeing You wasn't just a song. It was a promise, a prayer, a lifeline stretching between foxholes and farmhouse kitchens. And when Vera Lynn sang We'll Meet Again, mothers dabbed their eyes quietly. Soldiers closed their eyes in bunks far from home, and sweethearts clung to hope with every note. These songs didn't need grand instruments. They needed only a melody, a voice, and a listener willing to feel. And feel they did. Music became memory before the moment had even passed. A slow dance in the kitchen became a photograph in the mind. A song hummed at bedtime became a lullaby passed down for generations. Sometimes, music came from unexpected places. A harmonica played on a back porch, a soldier strumming a guitar during downtime, a church choir rising in harmony one Sunday morning as light streamed through stained glass windows. It didn't matter where it came from. What mattered was that it carried people through. Back then, people didn't skip songs. They listened. They let the music fill the spaces between heartbeats, between fear and faith, between absence and reunion. Records were handled like heirlooms. Turntables were turned with reverence. The click of the needle settling into place was a sacred sound in itself. And the words, oh, the words, so simple, so human. Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Sentimental journey. Moonlight becomes you. Every lyric felt personal, like it had been written for your waiting heart. For many families, music offered what the world could not. Certainty, beauty, a few peaceful minutes when everything just felt okay. It was how people coped, how they hoped, how they held on. In this way, music wasn't a luxury. It was a lifeline, a shared language between those at home and those overseas. A song could do what no telegram or headline could, remind you that you were still human, still loved, still whole. And as the war wore on, as ration books grew thinner and good news harder to come by, People turned to music like a familiar friend. It filled the kitchen while dinner simmered. It echoed in the silence of a letter just read. It played softly from radios as the lights went out and hearts whispered quiet prayers. Even now, decades later, those same melodies can stop you in your tracks. Maybe you're in the grocery store. Maybe you're folding laundry. And then suddenly, there it is, the faint crackle of a record, the tender lilt of a voice, and just like that, you're back in a kitchen with yellow linoleum, back on a dance floor with your best shoes, back in the arms of someone who promised to return. So, let's carry that music with us through the rest of this story and through every quiet night that follows, because music like that never really leaves. It lingers, it hums, and somewhere on the edge of sleep, you can still hear it. Long before streaming services or Saturday night television, there was the movie theater, a glowing marquee on Main Street, a quiet hush as the lights dimmed, and the familiar flicker of film reels springing to life. In the 1940s, going to the movies wasn't just a pastime, it was a ritual, a brief escape from ration books and worry, a place where, for just a few coins, you could sit in the dark and feel the world soften around you. The war was never far from people's minds, but on the silver screen, stories offered something different. Sometimes it was courage, sometimes romance, sometimes just the simple reminder that hope was still alive and well. Casablanca, released in 1942, became more than a film. It became a symbol. The black and white love story set against the backdrop of war spoke to something universal. The ache of sacrifice, the weight of choosing duty over desire, and the power of doing what's right, even when it hurts. People left the theater quiet, thoughtful, as if they'd seen a reflection of their own lives projected in shadows and light. Back home, small towns had their own beloved theaters, sometimes just one screen, wooden seats that creaked with every lean, and velvet curtains that parted like stage wings before each feature. Newsreels played before the main film, footage from the front lines, President Roosevelt speaking at his desk, soldiers marching, ships sailing. The war wasn't abstract, it was real, and it was there, every week, right in front of you, before the popcorn had even cooled in your lap. But cinema did more than inform. It united. Families, neighbors, and strangers all sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing at the same jokes, gasping at the same twists, wiping away tears during the same goodbye scenes. For those with loved ones overseas, these moments were more than entertainment. They were connection, a way to process the uncertainty, to feel less alone. Hollywood understood this. The U.S. government partnered with filmmakers to create wartime documentaries and patriotic reels. Frank Capra's Why We Fight series explained the reasons behind the war with stirring narration and real battle footage. It wasn't propaganda, it was clarity, a way to make sense of sacrifice. And when Clark Gable or Bette Davis took the screen, it didn't matter that they were stars. What mattered was that they felt familiar, faces of strength, grace, and resilience in a world that desperately needed all three. Outside the theaters, life was harder. But inside those dim, echoing halls, a kind of magic lived. You could hold hands in the dark. You could forget, just for a little while, about the war, about the telegrams, about the silence of an empty chair at the dinner table. For children, Saturday matinees meant cartoons and cliffhangers. For adults, it meant a bit of glamour, a chance to wear your best coat and feel like things were still normal. And when the credits rolled and the national anthem played, everyone stood, even the children, because it wasn't just a movie, it was a moment of unity. Back at home, stories lived on. People retold the plots around kitchen tables. They imitated accents and favorite lines and carried scenes in their hearts like postcards from another world. In some small way, cinema helped people hold on to something, an idea of what life could be again once peace returned. Even now, those old reels feel like time machines. A ticket stub tucked in an old book, a quote half remembered, a piano score drifting through memory like smoke from a cigarette. And just as swing music cradled the soul, film captured its shape. Together, they painted a portrait of a generation, not as victims of war, but as storytellers, as believers in something brighter. So the next time you hear that faint flicker, the whirring reel, the trumpet swell, the whispered line in the dark, pause for a moment. You're not just watching a movie, you're remembering a country that held each other through fear, dreamed together in theaters, and believed that every good story ends in peace. There was a time, not too long ago, when love didn't arrive in seconds through a glowing screen, but in the gentle unfolding of paper, creased and scented by distance. In the 1940s, a letter meant everything, especially during the war, when someone you loved was halfway around the world. The mailbox became sacred, a place of hope, of fear, of waiting. The mailman was more than just a civil servant. He was a bearer of dreams, of sighs tucked into envelopes. When he walked down the gravel path or climbed your front porch steps, he wasn't just delivering ink and paper, he was delivering presents, sometimes good news, sometimes nothing at all, and sometimes the letter you prayed would never come. But when the right letter did arrive, when you recognized the handwriting on the envelope, your heart skipped. You held it close before even opening it, because that paper had traveled across oceans and battlegrounds just to find you. Young wives read their husbands' words by candlelight. Mothers pressed notes from sons to their chests. Sweethearts read the same paragraph over and over, memorizing the loops and curves of each letter as if they were fingerprints. Inside those folded pages were details both grand and ordinary. "The nights are cold here," one soldier might write. "I saw a fox yesterday near the fence," another would say. "I miss the smell of your bread." Or, "Tell Dad I still can't beat his record at checkers." And in those quiet sentences, the war melted just a little, if only for a while. Many letters were kept in small boxes, tied with ribbon or twine, tucked into drawers lined with linen and memory. Some were read until the ink faded, some were kissed, and though they couldn't replace a hand to hold or a voice in the next room, they offered something close. Connection. Not all love letters were between couples. Children wrote to fathers overseas. Teenagers wrote to brothers. Neighbors wrote to sons of friends. Entire churches and classrooms sent bundles of hope. Even strangers wrote letters, thousands of them, as part of morale campaigns to soldiers whose names they didn't even know. Just a few kind words, a reminder that someone was thinking of them, that they weren't forgotten in some far corner of the world. And for those on the front lines, those envelopes were lifelines. They read them under moonlight in foxholes, clutched them in jacket pockets, folded them neatly beside rations and matches. They carried the scent of home, the warmth of memory, and the strength to make it through one more day. Some soldiers wrote back with trembling hands, some on typewriters at field desks, some on scrap paper between assignments, and some never got the chance. Their last words lived on through the letters they left behind. Handwriting mattered. Each slant, each smudge. It was human. Alive. There was patience in every paragraph, grace in every envelope, and a quiet kind of intimacy in waiting weeks just to say, "I miss you," long before text messages and emails, long before FaceTime or Skype. There was just a pen, a heart full of longing, and the courage to be vulnerable on a page. And maybe that's what made those words so powerful. They were written slowly, deliberately, with pauses, with tears, with love pressed between lines. Even now, if you ever come across one of those old letters, buried in a box, folded inside a book, framed on a mantle, you'll feel it, the weight of it, the sincerity, the soul. So when we think of wartime love, let's not just picture grand reunions or sweeping embraces. Let's remember the envelopes, the ink, the quiet joy of seeing your name written by someone far away, and the warmth that bloomed in your chest because they were thinking of you. A world at war, but hearts still finding each other across miles and months. And in those moments, those letters, peace lived, even if only for a page. After the last letter had been read and gently tucked away beneath a drawer of keepsakes, life in the 1940s continued, quietly, resourcefully, with a kind of everyday resilience that didn't ask for praise. It was a time when people made do, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. And in doing so, they discovered something remarkable, that in the face of limitation, creativity bloomed. Clothing, for instance, wasn't just something you bought and wore. It was patched, hemmed, turned inside out and re-sewn. A shirt might begin life on father, move on to mother with some tailoring, and finally be cut into squares for a quilt that would warm the next generation. Buttons were saved in jars, every shape and size rattling softly like memories when the lid came off. If a sock wore thin, you didn't toss it, you darned it, looping thread over a wooden egg, rebuilding it with patient fingers and the rhythm of care. There was pride in that kind of work. Quiet, humble pride, not in how new something was, but in how long it had lasted, and how many hands had helped it endure. Flour sacks became dresses, old curtains became aprons, newspapers were folded into wrapping paper, or used to line drawers, or twisted into starter logs for the stove. Even soap was saved. Slivers collected in tins, melted down into new bars when times got too lean. Nothing was ever really thrown away, because everything could become something else. Children learned these lessons young. They built toys from scrap wood and imagination. They made dolls from corn husks, marbles from clay. They created joy from almost nothing, and cherished it more deeply for that reason. Mothers knitted sweaters from yarn unraveled from older ones. Fathers resoled shoes at the kitchen table. Teenagers patch their own jeans because new ones might not come for a while. It wasn't just about survival. It was about heart. Every stitch, every nail, every twist of twine was a message. We may not have much, but we're still here, and we're making something of it. And there was beauty, too, in patchwork quilts that told a family story. Each square a memory, each thread tying generations together, in hand-carved toys, whittled by grandfathers who remembered a time before electricity, in handmade cards, drawn with colored pencils, sent for birthdays and holidays when store-bought ones felt too far away. Even meals were acts of creativity. A stew stretched with a little more water, leftovers reborn as casseroles, victory gardens out back providing not only food, but a sense of purpose. And through all this, through the mending, the saving, the constant reinvention, there was no shame. Quite the opposite. There was dignity. There was art. There was connection. Neighbors shared patterns and tips. Communities held clothing drives. Little magazines published instructions on how to make gloves from old coats or curtains from flour sacks. It was a culture of resourcefulness, of generosity, of turning less into enough. And it wasn't just women behind sewing machines or men behind workbenches. It was everyone, young and old, rich and poor, because everyone understood. In times like these, you give what you can and you build with what you've got. Looking back, it's easy to think of those years as hard, gray, and limited. But ask anyone who lived through them, and they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you about the joy of making, about the satisfaction in fixing something with your own hands, about the shared smiles when a coat was passed down, still warm, still useful, still part of the family. And maybe most of all, they'll tell you about the quiet sense of worth that came from knowing this home, this family, was built not on abundance, but on ingenuity. We live in a world now where things are replaced so quickly, thrown away, forgotten. But in the 1940s, a torn sleeve was a chance to practice patience. A chipped plate was still a plate, and an old item, repaired, reused, repurposed, held more value than anything brand new. So tonight, as you drift off in the stillness, maybe think of those hands, those stitches, those quiet, clever ways people made life work. Not perfectly, not easily, but beautifully. As the needle threaded its way through scraps of cloth and the nation stitched together what it could from rations and resolve, not all hands were treated the same. While families across America were mending, saving, and creating, there were others who were simply enduring. Because the truth is, the 1940s held both unity and injustice, both patriotism and prejudice, both hope and hurt. For many Black Americans, the promise of wartime opportunity arrived with the sound of factory whistles. Jobs once denied to them were suddenly open, not out of fairness, but out of necessity. Steel plants, shipyards, ammunition lines. Men and women who had been locked out for decades were finally allowed in. They worked side by side with white Americans, doing the same jobs, wearing the same uniforms, punching the same clocks. But when the shifts ended, the divides remained. Separate entrances, segregated buses, neighborhoods marked by invisible lines, lines that couldn't be crossed without risk. And yet, they served in factories, in hospitals, and on the front lines. The Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black 701st Tank Battalion, the long lines of nurses who treated wounds, but returned home to a country that wouldn't treat them the same. Still, they believed in something better, in something fairer, in a dream that hadn't yet been written down, but was still worth holding close. Farther west, in quiet neighborhoods with tidy gardens and trimmed hedges, another story unfolded. After Pearl Harbor, Japanese American families were uprooted, taken from their homes, their businesses, their communities. They were placed behind barbed wire in internment camps scattered across desolate land. These weren't soldiers. They weren't enemies. They were bakers, farmers, teachers, children, citizens. Their radios were confiscated, their schools shuttered, their family photos torn from the walls and packed into suitcases. They were told it was for security, but it felt more like punishment. And in the stillness of those camps, behind watchtowers and armed patrols, they waited, not just for release, but for recognition. And yet, even there, they built lives. They planted flowers near the barracks, formed baseball leagues, held graduation ceremonies with paper caps and borrowed gowns. They did what so many Americans did in those years. They made something from almost nothing. Latino Americans, too, stepped forward. Many worked the fields from sunup to sundown, their hands harvesting the food that would feed a nation at war. Others joined the fight overseas, wearing U.S. uniforms while knowing their families back home might not be welcomed at the corner diner. Native Americans served in some of the highest enlistment rates of any group. The Navajo code talkers, whose language confounded the enemy, helped secure victory in the Pacific. But even as they returned home as decorated veterans, they came back to reservations still forgotten by much of the country. America, in the 1940s, was a land of contradiction. It asked for loyalty but gave little in return. It demanded sacrifice but didn't share the reward equally. And yet somehow, through the noise and the silence, through the doors that opened for some and remained shut for others, there remained a kind of faith, a belief that maybe, just maybe, the next chapter could be better. Because people still held potlucks. They still sang the same war songs. They still planted vegetables and waited for letters from the front just like everyone else. And in those quiet acts, in those shared hopes, a fragile thread began to form, one that would eventually pull tighter in the decades to come. The war would end. The soldiers would come home. And the questions would linger. Who truly belongs? What does freedom mean? And how do we build a country that lives up to its own words? But for now, in the 1940s, it was a patchwork nation, stitched together not only by thrift and duty, but by courage. The courage to keep showing up, to work, to wait, to believe, even when the road wasn't equal, even when the door stayed closed. Next, we'll take a step into the world of children, a place where imagination thrived and joy could still be found in the simplest things. Even in a time shaped by ration books and radio bulletins, children found ways to be children, while their parents worried quietly by lamplight and brothers or fathers left home in uniforms. The youngest among them still chased marbles across wooden porches, built forts from blankets and chairs, and dreamed wild dreams with crayons in hand. Life for kids in the 1940s was far from easy, but it was tender, inventive, and full of small joys stitched into the seams of everyday life. There were no game consoles or television cartoons. Most families didn't own more than a few toys, perhaps a hand-carved train, a well-loved doll, or a baseball glove passed down from an older sibling. And yet, the world of play was boundless. Sidewalks became racetracks for scooters with metal wheels. Yards transformed into battlegrounds of imaginary wars. Wooden sticks became rifles, and tin pot lids turned into shields. Children drew hopscotch grids in chalk, played hide-and-seek until dusk, and dared each other to climb trees just a little higher than the day before. In the absence of abundance, they found magic in simplicity: a glass bottle of marbles, a jump rope with wooden handles, a slingshot made from a Y-shaped branch and an old tire tube. These weren't just toys. They were keys to entire worlds. At school, things were equally modest. Desks lined up in neat rows, a chalkboard up front, and a big American flag that hung proudly above it. Some schools were heated by coal stoves, and children took turns emptying the ash pans. Lunches were packed in wax paper, peanut butter sandwiches, an apple from the backyard tree, sometimes a leftover biscuit from last night's dinner. Teachers were strict but steady. They taught reading, arithmetic, and penmanship, with a ruler on the desk and kindness in their eyes. Lessons were interrupted now and then by air raid drills, or news that someone's brother wouldn't be coming home. But still, there was routine, and in routine, there was comfort. Morning pledges, spelling bees, the scratch of pencils across ruled paper. Many children contributed in quiet ways. After school, they helped in victory gardens, collected scrap metal, or ran errands for neighbors too old to stand in ration lines. Chores weren't optional. They were part of growing up. Feeding chickens, washing dishes, hanging laundry with clothespins in the wind. Saturdays were precious. That was the day to ride bikes until the sun slipped low, or head to the 5 and dime store with a few nickels jingling in a pocket. Some towns had a single movie theater, and for a dime, you could sit in the dark and be whisked away to faraway lands. As long as you didn't mind sharing your seat with the occasional squeak of a wooden floorboard or the smell of popcorn burnt at the edges. Books were a treasure. Libraries, when open, felt like castles. Children devoured Hardy Boy's mysteries, Nancy Drew's sleuthing adventures, and stories from distant worlds that had nothing to do with war. In the pages of books, they could travel far from blackout curtains and ration cards, and imagine a tomorrow that felt a little brighter. Evenings often ended with a bedtime story told by a parent who had lived through harder times still, or with a lullaby sung softly as the wind rustled the curtains and the warm hum of the radio filled the room. Not all childhoods were equal. Some were marked by poverty, others by grief. But even so, those years held a kind of innocence that glowed quietly in the dark. Because children, even in war, have a way of finding light. Their laughter, their games, their scribbled notes in school books. They remind us that hope isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the sound of hopscotch shoes on pavement. Sometimes it's a hand reaching into a lunch pail and finding a surprise cookie inside. That was childhood in the 1940s. Not perfect, not painless, but full of grit and grace and wonder. And as those children grew older, they would carry those memories with them, of small triumphs, of shared crayons, of swing sets that creaked in the wind, and the feeling of the world still waiting to be discovered. Coming up next, we'll leave the playground and step into a different kind of invention. The quiet birth of a technological revolution that would shape the decades to come. As the war raged on overseas, something quieter was stirring back home. In laboratories, in universities, in dimly lit rooms where minds worked late into the night. It didn't roar like fighter planes or boom like artillery, but its impact would one day reshape the world just as profoundly. This was the quiet beginning of the technological age. Most people in the 1940s couldn't have imagined a computer. To them, the word might have conjured up an accountant with a pencil behind his ear, not a machine. And yet, in a secret room at the University of Pennsylvania, a team of scientists was building something new, something massive, strange, and blinking with promise. It was called ENIAC, the Electronic Numerical Integrator and Computer. It filled an entire room, humming with vacuum tubes and cables, and looked more like a mechanical beast than the ancestor of the smartphone in your pocket. But ENIAC could do in seconds what once took weeks by hand. It was born out of war, created to calculate artillery trajectories faster than any human could manage. But it would live on long after the guns fell silent, laying the foundation for a digital world no one yet understood. Meanwhile, across laboratories in Bell Labs and beyond, another tiny revolution was unfolding. The transistor, no bigger than a fingernail, this sliver of invention would quietly replace bulky vacuum tubes, making radios smaller, computers faster, and communication more accessible. Few people knew its name then. Fewer still understood its significance, but it was there, the first heartbeat of the information age. And so, even as families gathered around radios to hear updates from the front lines, even as children did arithmetic on chalkboards and mothers wrote letters by candlelight, a new kind of future was quietly being wired into the bones of the decade. The 1940s were an age of tension and toil, but also one of brilliance. Radar systems were refined, jet engines were tested, scientists broke barriers in physics and whispered about things like atomic energy with both awe and fear. Technology in the 1940s wasn't yet personal. You couldn't hold it in your hand. You didn't carry it in your pocket. But you could feel it, emerging around the edges of life, in the quiet hum of a new machine, or the flicker of a reel-to-reel projector. Even on the home front, inventions shaped daily living. Pressure cookers helped preserve food. Synthetic materials replaced hard-to-find fabrics. Assembly line innovations from wartime production began to influence how goods were made and delivered long after the war ended. And while few folks could afford luxuries, many began to believe that the future might look different, a little easier, a little brighter, and perhaps a little more connected. It was, in a sense, the dawning of possibility, a time when wires still hung overhead like spiderwebs between poles, but voices traveled across them faster than ever. A time when the typewriter still clacked and the radio still hissed, but you could almost sense something faster was coming. This period laid the groundwork for the next great leaps, not just in science, but in how we'd live, work, and even dream. The children who played with Tinker toys and erector sets would grow up to build satellites. The boys who tuned radios would become the men who launched rockets. And the women who calculated figures by hand would help send astronauts to the moon. It all started here, in basements, back rooms, and quiet corners of America, where curiosity burned bright even in the midst of war. The 1940s gave us more than victory. It gave us momentum. And as the decade edged closer to its end, a nation once defined by factories and ration stamps was slowly shifting its gaze forward, toward new frontiers. It wouldn't be long before we'd trade telegrams for microchips and telegram boys for television screens. But for now, in the quiet pulse of machines, in chalkboards filled with equations, and in the soft whir of innovation, the future was beginning to hum. Coming up next, we turn from wires and circuits to a leader who guided America through the storm of both depression and war, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the transformation of a nation. Before America became the arsenal of democracy, before it emerged as a global superpower, there was a man in a wheelchair with a cigarette holder between his teeth and a quiet fire behind his eyes. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or just FDR as the country came to know him. He wasn't perfect. No president is. But in a time when the world felt uncertain, his voice on the radio brought calm to kitchen tables from Kansas to Connecticut. He spoke plainly, with a cadence that was slow, sure, and deliberate. And Americans listened. When he first took office in 1933, the country was in pieces. Banks had failed. Factories were silent. Families were lining up for bread and watching their hopes fade into dust. But FDR brought with him something rare: optimism with backbone. His New Deal wasn't just policy. It was belief. Belief that government could help, that people could rebuild, and that no one should be left behind. He gave the country something it had forgotten: a reason to believe in itself again. Fast forward to the 1940s. War had come, and with it, fear. But FDR had seen fear before. He'd faced it head-on, in polio, in politics, and in poverty. And now, as bombs fell in Europe and uncertainty loomed over the Pacific, he stood again behind the microphone, and he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It wasn't just a line. It was a challenge, and the nation rose to meet it. He mobilized the country like no one before him. Under his leadership, America transformed itself from a struggling economy into a powerhouse of production and unity. The factories roared. Steel turned to ships, and rubber to boots. Men enlisted, women welded, and children gathered scrap metal in schoolyards. Even in hardship, there was purpose. Even in sacrifice, there was pride. But Roosevelt didn't just build weapons. He built confidence. In homes across the country, families would huddle around the radio for his fireside chats. He spoke not like a distant leader, but like an old friend talking across the table with a cup of coffee between you. There was something about his voice, its steadiness, its humanity, that reminded people they weren't alone. He didn't shout. He didn't promise perfection, but he gave people something to hold on to in a world that felt like it was spinning too fast. And while the war raged on, he looked to the future: Social Security, job programs, infrastructure, rights for workers. He believed in more than just winning battles. He believed in building something that could last. Of course, not everything was fair. Not everyone shared in the prosperity. The road to equality was still long and winding, but FDR pushed the nation toward a broader vision, one that saw dignity not just in victory, but in every life touched by struggle. He would not live to see the end of the war. In April of 1945, as the world edged closer to peace, his heart gave out, worn down by years of labor and leadership. Across America, the news crackled through radios. People stopped in streets. Factory whistles fell silent. Even soldiers at the front paused to bow their heads, because whether you agreed with him or not, you knew He had carried the country when it needed carrying most. By the time the 1940s drew to a close, the nation he left behind was changed. It was stronger, more hopeful, more united. A nation that had once feared its own reflection was now looking outward, toward rebuilding the world, toward lifting others, toward defining freedom, not just in words, but in action. FDR didn't create that change alone, but he lit the way. He reminded Americans of who they could be, not just in triumph, but in compassion. And as we sit here tonight, in the quiet of a different century, his legacy still lingers in the hum of highways he helped build, in the steady check of Social Security, in the idea that no matter how dark it gets, a nation can find its way back to the light if it walks together. Up next, we step beyond the home front to witness the dawn of a new chapter. The war may have ended, but its echoes would reshape the world, from isolation to superpower. As the war began to wind down and the dust of global conflict slowly began to settle, something had changed, profoundly and permanently. America was not the same country it had been at the start of the 1940s, before Pearl Harbor, before ration books, before Rosie's rivets and factory shifts. America had stood somewhat apart, watching the chaos unfold overseas with cautious eyes, holding tight to the idea that 2 oceans were enough to keep the troubles of the world at bay. It had been a nation defined in part by distance. Distance from European wars, distance from colonial entanglements, distance from the messy business of world politics. But war has a way of collapsing distances. By the end of 1945, the oceans didn't feel so wide anymore. The borders didn't feel so far, and America no longer felt like a distant observer. It had become the beating heart of a new global order. The world that emerged after World War II was scarred, weary, and searching for stability. Europe lay in ruins, cities bombed into silence, nations drained of their youth and strength, and into that vacuum stepped the United States, not with conquest, but with power, presence, and influence, unlike anything it had wielded before. Factories that had once produced tanks now turned out refrigerators and automobiles. The same assembly lines that built bombers would soon build prosperity. Economically, the U.S. was booming. Industries surged. Jobs returned. Suburbs stretched toward the horizon. And with the Marshall Plan, America offered not just money, but a promise that it would help rebuild what had been broken, that it would not retreat behind its shores again, that it would stay. It was more than just economics. It was cultural, too. American movies, American music, American ideas. They spread like sunlight through a window into places long left in darkness. Suddenly, diners and jukeboxes, Coca-Cola and swing bands weren't just American symbols. They became global ones. And the American dream, that blend of opportunity, hard work, and freedom, became an export. But with that new role came new weight. Being a superpower wasn't just about having the most factories or the strongest military. It was about responsibility, about leadership, about helping steer a world still dizzy from war. There were fears, of course. The Cold War would rise. Nuclear shadows would stretch long. But for a brief, glimmering moment, there was hope. Hope that a better world could be built. One founded not on conquest, but on cooperation. Back home, the country wrestled with its own contradictions. Jim Crow laws still stained the South. Women who had found independence in wartime were expected to return quietly to kitchens. Not everyone felt the promise of post-war prosperity. Not yet. But even amid these tensions, there was momentum. Veterans came home to the GI Bill. College became possible for those who'd never imagined it. Homes were built, neighborhoods were formed, and the baby boom began. A whole new generation growing up in a country that seemed, at least for a while, unstoppable. And yet, amid all the headlines, the treaties, the factories, and flags, there were still quiet evenings, porches lit by soft bulbs, mothers folding laundry while the radio murmured, grandfathers sitting on porch swings, watching children chase fireflies across the lawn. Because even as America stepped into the role of global leader, its heart remained in neighborhoods, in families, in shared meals and whispered prayers. From isolation to superpower, from hesitant participant to global cornerstone. It wasn't a transformation born of ambition, but of necessity. The world had changed, and America had changed with it. And through all the noise of history, you can still hear it. A quiet confidence, shaped by sacrifice, forged in unity, and carried forward not by power alone, but by purpose. Next, we slow down again to something more personal, more still, because even after victory, the evenings returned. The quiet came back, and in the flicker of firelight and the gentle hum of peacetime, a nation took a breath. As the war ended and soldiers returned home, life didn't instantly shift back to what it had been. In fact, for many, it never would. You see, a decade of hardship, first the Depression, then the war, had changed the way people moved through the world. They had learned to live with less, to hold each other tighter, and to find quiet comfort in small, ordinary things. The late 1940s weren't about fireworks or fanfare. They were about returning to quiet evenings, to worn porches, to dinners made from memory rather than recipes, to a pace that once again allowed time to pass without hurry. In those evenings after the war, there was a hush, not of fear, but of reflection. Men who had seen too much sat silently by the fire. They didn't speak of battles. They listened to the crackle of wood, watched shadows dance on the walls, and mothers, who had worked long shifts and waited by radios, held their children a little longer at bedtime, as if time itself might be persuaded to pause. The front rooms of American homes became sacred spaces. There, you'd find a modest radio, still humming familiar melodies, the kind that didn't demand your attention, but gently settled into the background like an old friend. A soft glowing lamp, a hand-sewn quilt, a cup of tea left to cool on the table. These were the symbols of peace. No ticker tape parade could compete with the comfort of knowing your loved one was finally home, safe, breathing, present. Some nights, you'd hear laughter from a neighbor's yard. Someone had brought over a pie. Someone else brought news of a new job, a wedding, a baby. People didn't need much, not after all they'd been through. A game of cards, a record spinning slowly on the player, a candle flickering against the kitchen wall. Enough. There was also, in those nights, a quiet grief. Not everyone came home. Some chairs stayed empty. Some mailboxes never received their final letter. And so, for every joyful reunion, there was an unspoken ache, a place in the heart that would never quite be filled. That grief didn't scream. It sat beside people on those still nights. It leaned against the walls like a memory, and in its silence, it was honored. But hope had a way of pushing through even then. A soldier planted a tree in the backyard, a symbol of what he had survived and what he was choosing to build now. A girl who had lost her brother wrote poems by candlelight, each word a prayer for peace, and communities, stitched together by years of uncertainty, began to breathe again. They breathed slowly, softly, but they breathed. People made promises in those quiet evenings to never take time for granted, to gather often, to keep their doors unlocked, if not literally, then at least in spirit. And for a while, they did. That's the thing about the 1940s. It wasn't just the era of war or invention or politics. It was the era of endurance, of patience, of finding meaning in the everyday. It was the era of porches and patience, of family prayers whispered under wool blankets, of wooden radios glowing warm in the corner, telling stories to hearts that had finally begun to mend. So if you close your eyes tonight and listen closely, you might still hear it. That soft rustle of pages turning, the clink of dishes being put away, the slow exhale of a nation ready to begin again. The war had ended. But the story, the quiet, gentle, enduring story of America, was far from over. So now we've come to the end of our journey, a quiet walk through the 1940s, a decade marked by hardship and healing, by war and by reunion, by sacrifice and small, sacred joys. It wasn't an easy time, but it was a time people carried themselves with quiet strength. Not because they had no choice, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed in community, in duty, in holding on to one another when the world seemed to come undone. And somehow, in the stillness of the nights that followed, they found their way back. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture it. A small house on a quiet street. The lights are dim. Dinner dishes have been washed and dried, and the smell of something warm still lingers in the kitchen. Out back, a clothesline sways gently in the breeze. An apron, a towel, a child's shirt catching the last light of the evening. Inside, the radio hums, not loudly, just enough to fill the silence. Maybe Bing Crosby is singing low, or a soft voice is reading the nightly news, its tone steady and kind. A mother tucks in her little boy, presses a kiss to his forehead and whispers, "Daddy's home now. You can sleep." These weren't perfect times. There were divisions and griefs and lessons still left to learn. But there was also something we rarely speak of anymore. A sense of peace in knowing what mattered most. It wasn't having everything. It was having enough. Enough to eat. Enough to hope. Enough to dream again. Some say the 1940s were a simpler time, but maybe the truth is, they were simply more mindful, more aware of time, of each other, of the fragile, fleeting nature of everyday moments. People listened when others spoke. They looked you in the eye. They wrote letters by hand. And when they said goodbye, They meant it. That generation, they didn't talk much about what they'd seen. They didn't need to. Their silence said enough, but they passed something on, quietly, like a folded note slipped into a pocket. Be kind, be steady, take care of your home, love your neighbor, and when you're tired, rest without guilt. So, tonight, wherever you are, I hope you'll let yourself feel the quiet wisdom of those years. Let it wash over you like a warm blanket pulled up to your chin. You don't need to solve anything right now. You don't need to understand the world. Just breathe in, out. The past is resting and you are safe. The fire has burned low. The shadows have softened. And the world, just for a little while, is still. Tomorrow will come, with all its noise and motion and uncertainty. But for now, just rest. You're part of a long story. And tonight, a gentle chapter has closed. Thank you for joining me here, in the quiet corners of a time gone by. A time when courage looked like sacrifice, and love looked like a letter in the mail. Good night, my friend, and may your dreams be soft and your heart light. We'll meet again soon, right here in Sleepy Town Radio.